All right, so today we are going to be talking about speaking skills. I think the point here is mostly to do a refresher on COMS 101. And, it's probably been, maybe a semester or two since you last really thought about public speaking in a deep way. So we're going to cover some of that stuff and sort of just get you thinking about how you can best execute your speeches, for these first 7 informative speeches. And perhaps the most critical thing that you have to start with is just being organized. So just as a quick refresher, the parts of a speech, you have to have an introduction, right? And your introduction has a couple of different phases to it. The first is an attention getter. Now, Chris, what is your best advice for getting an audience's attention?
Usually some type of anecdote that you find in your research, or maybe that you have personal experience with, or someone close to you does. Opening statements that, questions are good as well, but you want to round those out. First of all, let your audience know what to do with the question. Let them know ahead of time. Okay, I'd like y'all to raise your hand if, or don't answer out loud, just think about this for a second. Something that gives them an indication of what to do with the questions, because sometimes when you pose questions to an audience, they'll think that you're actually interested in hearing what they have to say, especially when you get into more professional development and professional presentations where your speeches or your presentations are 20 minutes to an hour and a half long. When you're just getting started, sometimes people think you're using that to gather input. So as a speaker, one of the things you want to do with attention-getting comments, particularly when you're giving a short presentation, is inform the audience what to do with your questions. And then finally, I think another good way of having attention-getting comments is to begin with statistics that are tangential to your topic, not exactly your topic, because those folks that stand up and say, "Hi, my name is Chris, my topic is how it is that ocean temperature relates to global warming," most people are never going to remember that you said that.
That's so boring.
Yeah, and you've already blown it because you didn't take the time to get their attention. You didn't take the time to kind of warm them up to you as a speaker, and you've already come right out of the gate within the first 10, 15 seconds of what your topic is. And we know from research that most audience members aren't paying attention for about the first anywhere between 5 to 30 seconds. They're listening to you, but they're not really, they're hearing you, but they're not listening to you. In other words, they're getting the sound, but they're not mentally processing it. Instead, they're kind of sizing you up. So another good series of attention-getting devices might be current news reports. So let me stay with the global warming one for a moment. If I was going to talk about climate change, I might start with a simple description of the Paradise Fire and then move into another description of one that has, caused massive devastation. And then what I'm starting to do is my audience knows, okay, this clearly, out of all the things he could be speaking about, he's clearly getting into what happens with wildfires, probably as a consequence of climate change, and that's probably what this presentation is going to be about. But one of the things you're trying to do is you're trying to, in some ways, tease your audience into listening to you. You're not going to give them the full topic yet, but you're going to get them to start focusing their thoughts somewhere. And so it's just a little bit of warming them up to your topic area.
What I notice about what you said there is that you're doing a lot of talking about moving from the specific to the general, right? Their topic area is going to be a sort of generalized area for each speech, but there's specifics that make up that general area, and it's in those specifics that people get invested in an issue. The way you describe those specifics, right? You have to use like concrete language. You have to make some choices about how maybe you can use some language that's a bit surprising or maybe value laden, emotion invoking, something that tells the audience, hey, you care about this,
right.
And we're always more inclined to care about things that we view ourselves in and that we can concretely imagine. If I were, think about when you were a kid and your parents were like, eat all your vegetables, there's children starving in, X country. It was probably low-key racist, but still, they probably said it. Well, you didn't care about children in those countries.
Because you had no connection to
them. You had no connection to them. You were a child. You had no way of thinking about these things. But if your parent had known someone in country X and had been like, hey, think about your cousin in country X and how they're suffering right now, yeah, that would have been more gripping for you probably. That would have been a little bit more. So I think that this moving from the specific and using concrete language to the more abstract is, I think, a really important insight there. And the other thing that I want to say, and I want to comment on something you said earlier, these sort of ask your audience to raise your hand questions, these are good in so much as you can predict that your audience is actually invested in the topic. I've seen in my public speaking class, one time, some dude gets up. I've actually seen this multiple times. A dude gets up, he or she says, hey, raise your hand if you like soccer.
They've already blown it, right?
Yeah.
Because you know exactly what their question's going to be about, or what their speech is going to be about.
It's going to be about soccer,
Right.
and also
Right.
half the class doesn't raise their hand.
Right.
So you've told half your class that I'm going to talk to you about something that you're not interested in. So they're immediately unplugging. So if you're going to do like a raise your hand if, you got to make sure that that's going to be a pretty shared experience for people.
Sure.
And I also think one that connects to them emotionally or values-wise.
I was going to say one of the ways to think about it, and I meant to say this when I said start with questions, is don't ask one question. Because most people that are novice speakers will begin with one question that reveals their topic. How many of you in here like soccer? How many of you in here are afraid of climate change? As opposed to, how many of you in here don't like hot weather? How many of you in here don't like extremely cold weather?
Yeah.
How many of you don't like inconsistent weather patterns, right? And most of us are probably going to be at some point, we're either probably half and half in the camp of heat versus cold, but you've included the audience. And then when you talk about unpredictable extreme weather, most people are like, yeah, that kind of, we're getting a lot of that and that sucks. Same thing with soccer. How many of you in here enjoying watching any kind of sports, whether it's little league, whether it's high school, whether it's college or professional? And at some point, you're probably going to get a good percentage of the class to raise your hand.
Probably the majority.
Right. And then you narrow it down. And that's what you're doing in the overall introduction, is you're starting to narrow down your specific speech focus given your general topic area. And I think that's an important point to make. So we're really probably going to encourage you to think of your attention getter, and you've heard this. This has been drilled into you with the 5-paragraph essay form that you've had to do in English composition classes. Write your opening sentences and write your thesis statement and your preview. So your first paragraph, write that after you've worked through the bulk of the paper. Same thing with your speeches. Once you've actually got down your main points, your evidence, the claims you're making, etc., think about what then would be a crafty way to generally orient your audience to that topic and then subtly reveal what the specifics are. Because if you start with the specifics and try to go general, that generally leads audiences to be really confused.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good insight here. So let's move on to the next part of an attention getter. And what we put here is social significance. And you're probably used to this being presented as like some kind of credibility building statement. But, if I'm being frank, you are probably sophomores, mostly sophomores and juniors. Maybe there's some freshmen, maybe there's some seniors, but for the most part, man, what was I saying? I'll have to edit this. It's cool. What I was saying. So you'll notice that what we have here is a social significance statement, and you're probably used to seeing that as a credibility builder. And the reason that we go for a social significance statement here is it really boils down to this. Y'all don't really have much credibility yet. You're most of you are sophomores and juniors. We have a couple freshmen, we may have a couple seniors, whatever. But you haven't really done the things with your life that would cause someone to consider you to be an expert, right? You need to have a very high degree of education or a very long experience in a field to be considered an expert. And, just getting up there and being like, well, I read an article this week, so I'm credible on this subject. That's not valuable. Like even as someone who is delivering a presentation in another class, doing a credibility builder is like, well, I read all these articles and now I'm giving you my presentation for class. That really doesn't build your credibility at all. It's much more effective to tell your audience like why your topic and the thing that you're speaking about merits their attention. What is the significance of this? How does this affect society? How does it affect people? And why should we care? It's just sort of like, I kind of think of this as being like a soft attention getter, or maybe like the closing statement.
So the difference that I use is I talk about the attention getter being the bait In other words, it's what gets the fish's attention, right? The lure or the egg or the worm or whatever you're using, it gets the fish to say, out of all the things that I have visual acuity for, this one just caught my attention. But it's not until the fish bites on the hook that you actually have the fish. So attention getting comments and questions, however you choose to use attention getting statements or questions, get people's attention. And then after that, what you want to do is give them a buy-in. Why in the F should they care about listening to you as a peer for the next 6 to 8 minutes? And when you use credibility statements and you've done exactly what all other 48 people in this class have done, which is I read some articles last week and I'm now here prepared to talk to you about them. It's like, okay, what you're trying to do with your introduction and overall in your speech is you're trying to differentiate yourself as better than others, right? And credibility statements help that when you indeed have some kind of credibility that sets you apart from others. But when, maybe out of 48 students, 42 have some kind of, or have no experience with a given topic other than what they've read. However, there might be a handful of you here and there that maybe if you've got the living wage topic or you've got the homelessness topic, maybe you have that experience. And in that case, we will say, consider using that as a credibility statement. But for the most part, if your credibility comes from reading articles online, that really doesn't do much for your credibility. It says, hey, I'm just like every one of you. When you want to take this moment to say, I stand out over and above you, when you're using credibility statements in the second part of your introduction, we encourage that social significance. And the social significance is simply matching your audience's demographic as best you can to your topic area. So if I'm talking about public health concerns, I might want to talk about how the rates of infection of COVID affected people between the ages of 15 and 25. I might then pivot and say, hey, on top of that, listen to how diabetes as a public health concern affects people from 15 to 25. And I give those ratios, and then we move on to the next topic, or the next subset, which is our thesis or purpose statement. This is where you're revealing the specifics of your speech for today. So let me go back. If I'm going to say something about why the federal government should invest more money in public health concerns, right? I might do the social significance according to the CDC after the numbers have been crunched during the COVID crisis and lockdown. 1 out of every 5 adults, young adults from 15 to 25 contracted this. And then according to the CDC, 1 out of every 4 young adults are probably pre-diabetic, if not diabetic, they just haven't been diagnosed. And then I say, so today in my speech, I'm here to talk about why the United States federal government should invest more money in public health concerns that govern, public health concerns that affect members of the United States.
Yeah, I think with this thesis purpose statement thing, the bottom line is that you have to match it to the goal of your speech, right? That thesis is usually associated with a more persuasive or argumentative kind of speech, and that purpose statement is usually associated with an informative or an unbiased kind of speech. I oftentimes find that young people sort of have a difficulty moving out of the persuasive argumentative mode where you're trying to convince your audience of something rather than just teach them about something. I think there's something inherent to us as human beings that we come into these topics and we do have a point of view when we enter them, and we find some information and that supports our point of view. And so once we've had that sort of like confirmation bias happen, it's hard to then craft an informative purpose statement as opposed to a persuasive thesis statement, because we instinctually want to advocate. So one of the things that I would say is like really make sure that when you're setting your purpose statement, make sure that your purpose is an informative purpose, not a persuasive purpose. If the purpose, if you say, the purpose of my speech today is to give you these reasons why people support X, and you're not tempering that with, I'm also going to tell you about reasons why people oppose X, then you've moved into this sort of argumentative persuasive mode. And that really is not what we're looking for in this first set of speeches.
Yeah, what we're looking for in the first set of speeches, like John said, is informative speeches in which you are debriefing your peers in your group and the 350 consulting groups about whatever the topic is that you're looking at. And so in that sense, for the first, 7 presentations?
Yeah, it's 7.
Right. Yeah, for the first 7 informative speeches, you generally want to err on the side of using purpose statements. And then when you get to the informative deliberative, those of you who are going to present some of the delivered options are going to be basically giving a thesis. I'm here today to argue why you should consider using cloud seeding as an approach to climate change adaptation, as opposed to lowering CO2 emissions as a form of mitigation.
And they're certainly going to be doing this in the debates at the end.
Oh, for sure, in the debate. So the takeaway here is this: for the first, basically half of the course, most of your speeches and presentations in this part of the introduction should consist of a purpose statement. I'm here today to teach you about, and even though you might personally say, okay, I'm going to teach about 3 different things, I technically agree with the second one more than anything else. That doesn't need to be in your speech. You're not there to persuade them, you're there to inform them. And this distinction is really difficult because I think most of us have a sense that when we're giving information, we're also kind of subtly persuading them that this information is credible. And when we're persuading people, we're oftentimes giving them information that they're not aware of. But I think learning to match your purpose with the speech is really important, okay? And so for informative speeches, generally it's purpose statements about informing the audience, and then for persuasive speeches or argumentative speeches, it's about thesis statements that advance a particular point.
And you really do want to be mindful about not tipping your hat and letting people know where you fall in the opinion zone. It's always tempting after a point or a statement or whatever it is, like Chris said, to sort of have an aside where it's like, well, really, I favor this one. They don't need to know. And them knowing, that might end up working against you.
Yes, that affects your credibility.
Yeah, so avoid that. So after your thesis and purpose, then you got to preview your points. You're going to have some number of points. We're going to recommend 3. We'll talk about that in a second. But preview your points. Tell us, it's the basic essay speech, or the essay composition structure, where it's tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. This is the tell them what you're going to tell them part. I'm going to speak about climate change today, and I'm going to have the following 3 points. 1 is going to be the impact of climate change on the economy. 2 is going to be the impact of climate change on education systems. 3 is going to be the impact of climate change on international relations. Something like that.
Right, and I really like, one of the things I want to point out, and I think John did that really well right now, is you want your previews to be just that. You want them to be a preview. You don't want them to be a mini description of each of your main points. So I'm here today to talk about how climate change will affect the economy, because businesses aren't going to be able to afford all the new technology that's out there without increasing costs on consumers.
And now you're giving a speech.
Now I'm giving a mini speech, right? And so instead, I'm here to talk about how climate change affects the economy, and then whatever the other
3 were. I was just making it up as I went there.
Right.
But that I think is critical. If you don't preview your points, what you are creating for your audience is anxiety. They don't know.
I like that.
They don't know the agenda, right? Like, think about the number of classes that you've gone to where a teacher has not at the beginning of a class said, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and you're kind of like, when the fuck is this break coming?
Right, yeah. Or you're thinking, what is important?
Yeah.
Should I be writing down everything this person is saying? And until you get up into higher division courses where you've got like seminar style presentations, no, you're not going to be writing down. You shouldn't be writing down everything the instructor says, because there are layers of what's important and what's not. And what the preview does is kind of give your audience a sense of, here are the important things, so that as you start to blank out a little bit, when you hear my transitions or you hear me say some key words, that's probably pretty important to pay attention to. And without doing that, like John said, I love that. I've never thought of it that way. You do leave your audience in a state of anxiety where they're going, okay, so what am I listening to for the next 6 to 8 minutes, and what's important, and oh man.
Think about every family gathering that you've been to where you're like, when is it okay to leave?
Yeah.
Like, people are like that during your speech. If they don't know how many points you're going to have, and you're like, okay, I've done a point. I've done another point. At point 3, most people are going to think that that's time to end, but sometimes there's reason to have another point. And then you get to that 4th point, and people are like, okay, what's going on here, right? And you just want to cut that off.
Right. Right.
So after the preview, you're going to transition into your body. Now, when we talk about transitions, students actually have a lot of questions about transitions, and I'm not sure why. Other than that, we don't do a lot of good transitioning in regular speech, like regular communication, like interpersonal communication is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So the easiest transition, you are going to have a knee-jerk reaction to that says it can't possibly be this simple, but it is that simple. You simply say, now that we have our agenda set, let's talk about my first point. Like, that's the easiest way to transition out of an introduction. All right, now that you know the agenda, let's transition into point number one, which is blah, 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 blah.
Right. And you can be creative with this. So I have two things I want to say here. The attention getter and social significance are a little bit more formalized in content. And what I want to say about thesis and purpose, as well as preview, is the takeaway, at least for me as an instructor, is to get my students to err on the side of clarity before eloquence. The spoken word, both being spoken and being listened to, is much different than the written word. Many of you all are really, really good writers. I'm kind of still just taken back by the difference between the first half of my career teaching and my second half, and how well students have learned to write. However,
that's cool.
When you read or you use that kind of language in a speech, especially in key moments like the purpose, the preview, and the transition, you run the risk of really losing your audience's ability to understand. Some folks will come on and say, aren't I insulting my audience when I tell them here are the 3 points, or today I'm here to talk about X, or here are the 3 things I'm going to cover? The reaction to that is, we understand why you might think that, because certainly when you think about really good public speakers, they're so eloquent that they don't need to be clear. But most of us, I'd say 95% of the time, no one's going to have a problem with you saying, my speech today is going to be about this, and in doing so, I'm going to cover 3 points.
Yeah.
Because it's clear, it's easy to follow. Over the last 30 some odd years of teaching public speaking, I can't tell you how many times out of public speaking, I could easily have taken a student aside, or a bunch of students aside, and said, hey, what did you think Skiles' speech was about? And they'd be like, there was a lot of information in it, but I really don't know.
Yeah.
Because it was so convoluted and difficult to understand. Okay, so for thesis, purpose, and for preview, err on the side of clarity before eloquence. For the transition to the body, one of the things I want to suggest, like John said, it's easy to use meta-communicative orienting statements. In other words, communication about communication. Now that you know our agenda, let's get started. And what I did right there is I gave a little bit of a pause. And pauses make for really, really good transitions. As a speaker, as a beginning or even an intermediate speaker, it's uncomfortable to get used to this. But giving your audience a second or even 3 seconds to just kind of reflect on what you said, and to be confident while you're up in front of that audience, non-verbally, to be confident, letting that information just rest, that actually really helps people a lot. So consider using intentional pauses as well as meta-communication to move between your preview and your first main point of the body of the speech, as well as between the main points in the body of the speech. We'll come back to that in a bit.
Okay, well, let's transition then. Now that we've covered the introduction, let's transition into the body. So, body, it's got some components. It's going to have a main point, your main point 1. This is the one that you would enumerate in your preview. My first point is, and that enumeration is valuable. People like things that are enumerated, 1, 2, 3, and we are going to be recommending to you that you have 3 main points. This just goes all the way back to the beginning of our discipline, where it's Aristotle, right, who points this out.
It's basically just the ancient Greeks. So
just universally.
Socrates, Plato, Aristotle.
Cicero. 3 is just like a magic number.
It's called the golden mean in from the ancient Greeks, and it was the idea that in order to be a really well-rounded person, you needed to focus on your mind, your body, and your spirit, not just your mind and body. And so the ancient Greeks really kind of honed this orientation toward triplets as opposed to binaries. And so all you need to think here is, probably most of you in your 101 class or wherever you took public speaking were taught to have 3 main points. And that's fine. The general research in terms of the 20th and 21st century indicates that for short presentations, so anything from about 6 minutes up to about 20 minutes, is two to four main points is ideal. Less than two, and there's no differentiation of content, and people are just kind of like, what am I supposed to remember from this?
Yeah.
More than four, and it's just too much information overload too quickly. So for short presentations, the idea there is striving between 2 to 4. Like I said, the ancient Greeks work off of 3, so most of us in the discipline work off of 3 as well.
Well, and I'm going to say this, like, who am I to challenge Aristotle?
Right.
I am no one. And that dude's stuff is stuck for
over 2,500 years.
Yeah.
Once we started actually doing social scientific research on audience surveys and stuff like that about public speaking in about the 1930s through the 1950s is the basis of that, and then it kind of took off from there. Basically, the social scientists were like, we thought we discovered that Aristotle was wrong, and no, he wasn't.
Yeah, it just turns out that dude was right.
He knew it.
Which is like pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you got a main point. It's going to have some supporting material. That supporting material is going to be sources that you read that are prescribed to you in this course. In other situations, there'll be sources that you find of your own volition or whatever. When I say sources that are prescribed to you, I mean like we've given you a topic area, and we have told you what types of sources to use. You'll go find them for yourself. We're not going to hand them to you. Because part of this course is, of course, developing your research skills and getting comfortable using all the databases and things like that. But you'll have some supporting material. Maybe there's one subpoint, maybe there's two subpoints, maybe there's no real like subpoints, but there's like one piece of evidence that you're going to really look at in depth. And so I guess the thing that I'm trying to tell you here is that once you say you're going to inform someone about something or you make a claim about something, you have to back it up. And that means that you need to have read something or viewed something or listened to something. You have to have come into some information from someone who has more expertise than you, unless you're doing your own original research in which you're making observations and running statistical tests and getting peer reviewed. You're not doing that. Right. So go find some sources.
Real quick caveat off of that is even high-level experts will use supporting material in their presentation. So let's say the Surgeon General of the United States is giving a public briefing or a press conference or is speaking at a conference and is talking about, I'll stay with diabetes just because it's easy here. This is the top medical official in the United States of America. And for those of you who are very proud of the healthcare system we have, you should be very in awe of this person. And for those of you who are very, very critical, you should understand that this person didn't just volunteer. They got chosen out of being an incredibly talented physician. Okay, so Surgeon General of the United States is a very, very high-level, expertise-driven position. However, even when they give presentations, let's say they start talking about what happens with fluctuating blood sugar levels. Even though they are considered one of the top medical experts in the United States, top medical official in the United States, but one of the top medical experts, they usually will turn and say, okay, and the reason I'm saying this is because the most recent study coming out of the National Institutes of Health, the most recent study coming out of a compilation of research in all throughout Western Europe, the most recent study funded by the CDC indicates this, this, and this. So even though they're the top expert or top official, they're still citing other research to say, basically, here's the metaphor. I'm going to say some things about blood sugar levels and how it affects people and age and diet and stuff like that. And then I take a second, I go, basically, metaphorically, don't just listen to me, listen to what this other source has to say. So I cite the source, I build that source's credibility, and then I share that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're just going to transition.
Yep.
Transition to the next point, same as before. Say what you've talked about so far, tell them what you're going to talk about next, then talk about it.
Yep.
And that's how it goes for all of your main points, right? You're going to have a point, you're going to have some supporting material to make your point, and then you're going to transition.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, you're going to end up at a conclusion. That conclusion is where you summarize these main points. Do it simply. You don't have to do it like in some cockamamie fancy way.
No, in the same way that you want your preview to be very clear and succinct, you want your summary or your review to be very clear and succinct too. So today we've
Absolutely.
talked about the economic effects of climate change. We've talked about whatever else the other two John started in the beginning, and that's it. And you just need to simply reference the label. You
Yeah.
don't necessarily need to explain things in more detail.
I like that way of talking about it. Reference the label. Each one of these points has a label.
Right.
And that's what you're talking about here in your preview and your summary. And then you need to have a memorable or maybe decisive closing statement. Most people end their speeches with, well, that's my speech.
Or okay, thank you.
Yeah, that does not re-emphasize why the speech took place in the first place. This memorable, decisive closing statement should re-emphasize why the speech or the topic itself was important. The last thing you say should be something that your audience walks away with feeling like they have something to think about. And if you're not doing that, you're just not doing it right.
Right. There are three things I like to say about closing statements. The first is, it's a term of art that I learned when I started in speech competition back in junior college, and it stuck with me throughout my time in competition, my time as an undergraduate, and the 30 years I've been teaching. And that is that your closing statements should, here is the term of art, so in quotation marks, lend finality to your speech. There should be a sense of, okay, now I really do understand this speech is coming to an end. 3 different ways to do this. The first is to change your presentation dynamic. Think of really good podcasters, or think of really good public speakers, or sometimes even our professional news people who, by the time they get to the end of their broadcast, will start to slow down their pace a little bit, put a little bit more intentional inflection into what it is that they're saying, and give you time to contemplate what it is they've spoken about. So you want to perform your closing statement to lend finality. In gymnastics, we call it sticking the landing. Regardless of how well the performance has been, at the end, you want to do that thing where your knees are bent and you stick them straight, and you throw your hips back and your shoulders up and your neck up and all this kind of stuff, right? So think about being able to perform your closing statements as well. And that's a function of really intentionally increasing that inflection and putting pauses into what you're saying. The second thing about closing statements is it works really well to return to, if you can, your attention getter. If you started with a story, if you started with statistics, however you began, returning back to that literally and metaphorically brings the speech full circle. And that's a really easy way to lend finality. Oh, he started with this description of the Paradise Fire. I could only pay attention for some of this because I just, my mind was wandering, I was distracted. But I can tell that he's about to end, or she's about to end, or they're about to end, because here we are talking about the Paradise Fire again. Okay, so it's always easy to return to your attention-getting comments in your closing statements to signal finality. And the final thing I'll say is what John said. It buttresses what John had to say. And that is that if you give your audience something to really think about, something to contemplate, if you give them a challenge, if you will, that's a really good way to end it. So in closing, I know there's a lot of hype about what we're doing with adaptation and mitigation for climate change. And what I've talked about today is that while electric vehicles are really expensive, the reality is, in the long run, they're probably going to save you a lot of money, and they're going to help you help the environment.
Yeah. All right, so let's transition now from organizing speeches to the need to perform. And the first thing you see, this harkens back to what I said day one. This class is about getting you to occupy the stage in a way where you can make eye contact, not read, and deliver a performance that's going to connect your audience to you, if not you to them.
Right.
So don't read, perform. In your introduction, this is your only opportunity to capture your audience's attention. I just want to re-emphasize that you have to be engaging. If you are in your introduction reading Your audience has already checked out. You have already done something that indicates to them that you are not a serious person. And so I would avoid that. Don't read. Don't read throughout your whole thing, but especially in the introduction. Reading indicates a lack of interest in the audience's experience, in the topic, in preparation, and in professionalism. It just says that you're a clown. Don't do it. I don't know what else to say about that. I understand that this is the number one thing that students struggle with, and it's because you're nervous. And it's because you think that if you don't look at your audience, that you will somehow be less nervous. But if you just look at them, and you recognize their humanity, and you let them recognize yours, you will be less nervous.
So one of the things that differentiates humans from animals in non-verbal, with I guess animals would be non-vocal communication, is body language. And animals signal, let's take dogs for instance, animals signal a lot of friendliness or aggression by their tails and their ears. With humans, it's almost always eye contact. And in different culture contexts, we need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes direct eye contact can be seen as threatening, and sometimes eye contact avoidance is seen as threatening. For the most part, from what a lot of the research in audience survey studies with respect to public speaking has shown, is that direct eye contact with the audience, even if it's not that particular person, but if the audience sees you looking at people and you eventually catch their eye, they feel a sense of, John uses the word engaging, I use the term immediacy. You help indicate that you have an energy to be present with your audience. And good public speakers, and I'm going to cue up some examples once we're back in person for you, just quick examples to show you this. Good speakers have that sense of immediacy. You feel like you're being spoken to directly because the eye contact is there, it's there with other people, and they're not reading their presentation. And that signals this sense of, oh my gosh, even though they're talking to an audience of 80 students or 120 students or 300 people, their demeanor and the fact that they're not reading and they have eye contact makes it seem like I'm just talking to them directly, just having a conversation with them.
Well, and that's the goal, right?
That's
is
the
to just
goal.
seem to like you're having a conversation with your audience. That you're just telling them some information that you know, that you're warm, you're friendly, y'all like each other, y'all are interested in the same kind of stuff, and that it's kind of just like a nice chat. And if you can achieve that, you've achieved a lot. I would say don't ask rhetorical questions as an attention getter.
So rhetorical questions are different than the information questions.
Yeah.
That I was speaking about in the beginning.
A rhetorical question is a question that doesn't ask your audience to respond in any way. It just is meant to like get your audience to, I guess you're asking them to like answer a question in their own mind for you. And the trouble with that, as I see it, is that you don't know what their answer is going to be.
Right.
And if their answer is no, but you needed it to be yes, you haven't really done a great job.
So one of the ways that I was taught as a beginning debater, and I teach people in debate and public speaking, is the general aphorism, don't ask, clarify, or argue. Don't ask, clarify, or argue. So if I was kind of finishing a main point in the body of my speech, I might be tempted, because we hear this all the time in pop culture and in just in our culture context, in casual conversation. Well, why wouldn't you want to buy an EV? And technically what tends to happen is there are audience members that even if they're friendly towards you, they go, well, they're friggin' expensive and they're hard to find and we don't have the charging infrastructure for it, even though you just covered one of the main points. In other words, you start to, when you ask questions of your audience in your presentations, outside of stylized questions up in the introduction, in the beginning, when you use rhetorical questions as opposed to informational or clarifying questions, you run the risk of people building up just a little bit of resistance to what it is you're saying. Well, why wouldn't I want to buy it? Or who wouldn't want to buy an EV? And there are audience members that will instinctively say, well, we can't afford them. They're not time trusted. We don't have the infrastructure. Even if your speech is about why you should buy one. Okay?
Yeah.
So rhetorical questions that are basically an argument or a point of clarification embedded within them, you flip them around, and as an advocate, you're far more credible and productive in making the statement or making the argument than you are posing the rhetorical question.
And I would say, as a general rule, this next one, don't ask people to raise their hands unless you have a really good sense that your audience is going to mostly raise their hands and that it's acceptable for you to lose that minority of the audience. Mm-hmm. I would also say don't do raise your hands if you don't have 2 or 3 questions that are going to capture different segments of the audience in different ways so that you do capture the majority of the audience. Chris and I already talked about this earlier, but just a reminder, right? That is a one-off. It doesn't work. So what you want to do is you want to tell value, emotion-laden stories. Chris talked about moving from concrete examples to the abstraction of your topic area. Make sure that you're using, information that speaks to people's values and emotions. Might share surprising facts, make them relatable.
So that one's really important. Let me speak here for a second. I think one of the things you want to get in the habit of doing is being sensitive to your audience's demographics. And this is something that we have all different terms for it. Audience adaptation, rhetorical sensibility, etc. You all do this already when it comes to interpersonal and small group interactions. You sit around and let's say you just recently, like within the last 3 months or 6 months or the last year, have started dating someone. When you sit with your friends from school, you're going to share information that you would never share with your grandmother or your grandfather, or probably even your parents, right? And the idea there is you're reading the room, you're reading your audience. And so you want to do this with facts and statistics, make them relatable to your audience. So right now, your audience is comprised of people that are probably anywhere between about 18 to 23, maybe 24 years old. When you get out into whatever profession and industry you get out into, and that's probably statistics say that's going to change too, you're going to have to adapt and be able to, you're going to have to adapt the research that you find and look for research that affects your core audience. So all of a sudden, you're out of college and let's say you become a pharmaceutical rep, you're going to be speaking to people who at least have an AA in some kind of nursing degree, if not people who are MDs and above. So you have a group of people that are medically trained and probably have a wide variety in their ages. You're going to have to pivot from speaking to people and using examples that are relatable to 18 to 25-year-olds to people that are anywhere between 22 to 70 years old. And so learning to make them relatable is twofold. First, it's trying to find research that relates directly to the demographic you're speaking to as much as possible. And second, if it doesn't, you become the person that frames the research that's external to that audience's demographic for that audience. Easy way to do this. Even if you don't fall within the range of the 15 to 25-year-olds who have prediabetes, you know someone who does. If this information sticks with you, or if this helps this information stick with you, I want you to think about your cousins. I want you to think about your neighbors. I want you to think about friends and family members that fall within that age group, and maybe that'll make this information a little bit more interesting for you. And that little bit of framing goes a long way in terms of syncing that point with the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And last, if you're funny, tell a joke. Make it appropriate. Sometimes people like to push boundaries with jokes, and this is probably not the time for that.
I would say don't push boundaries. Add some levity.
Yeah.
That's the way I like to think about jokes, because we think about jokes, and man, I've had students just blow their credibility with this and blow the whole performance with this, because it's either tangential or it's not appropriate for a general audience. But if you can think of ways to lend some finality, even what are those? Why am I blanking on what those things are called when they're puns?
Yeah.
Even puns, dad jokes, basically, is what we call them now, right? Even those can still land with an audience, even if it's just a moment to say, that was a corny joke, but you know what? Yeah, good job. Like, you're talking about something as serious and deadly as diabetes, and you had a good little, like, kind of humorous thing there.
As a man who spent 4 years telling bad jokes, people love them. All right, so sustain eye contact. This is huge. This is part of the don't read, perform thing. You need to sustain your eye contact. It's got to be at least 70% of the time. Like, you need to be, the vast bulk of your speech needs to be you sustaining eye contact with people in the audience, or if you're doing like an online presentation, you need to be looking into the camera. That's just how human beings connect to each other. So it needs to be the bulk of it. It's okay to look at your notes if you get off track. Look back down at them, have a good extemporaneous style speaking note. If you are not fully familiar with extemporaneous style speaking notes, there are examples in a million different public speaking textbooks, but also I believe there's examples on the Canvas that you should just lift and use.
And there's tons that's available in YouTube tutorials and things like
you should
that.
just access some of those, but you should have learned this in Intro to Public Speaking.
And if you didn't, or you're still not comfortable with it, please come to us during office hours, talk to us after class. I mean, don't neglect to use us. I mean, we're here being the lab leaders here. We will be more than happy to help you with that.
Absolutely.
With that skill set. It's something you should already be exposed to, and it's something you can easily familiarize yourself with through external sources, but we're here too.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're reading a short, direct quote as evidence in support of a point or a claim, I think it's fine. And I would announce it. I'm just going to quickly read to you from this report.
Yep.
And then, you pop on your glasses or whatever, and you read the report.
And the key there is twofold, is don't make your evidence passages too long, but also make sure not make sure, but my encouragement would be for you to change your inflection. Raise your voice pitch a little bit, maybe lower your voice pitch so that it's clear these are not your words. These are words coming from someone else, and you might want to play with the rate of delivery as well. If you're someone who tends to speak a little quickly and you're going to read a direct passage, slow it down. If you're someone who is kind of slow and contemplative, when you get to reading a direct passage, like I said, change your intonation, your inflection, basically your vocal pitch, and then from there, change your rate of delivery.
Don't read from your notes because you're nervous.
Oh, that's the worst one.
Like,
that is all that's going to do.
Awful.
All that's going to do is drive that anxiousness and that nervousness more, because what's going to happen is you're inevitably, like I tend to do in casual conversation, and I kind of feel like this is because we just set this up as a podcast to talk through these ideas. I will mispronounce things, and I've learned over the course of time doing extemporaneous speaking that's absolutely acceptable. No one cares.
No one cares.
No one cares. But if you make a big deal about mispronouncing it, that can be a little bit of a problem. So when it comes to reading from notes because you're nervous, guess what happens? You overemphasize, you're overly engaging visually with those words, and you're also looking ahead a little bit. If you think about when you've done this before, and I think we all have, you're usually looking ahead a few words of the words that you're attempting to pronounce, and you're going to mispronounce them, and then that throws you off, and you have to go back to where you were, and people can tell, oh my gosh, they're reading this speech. And what that's going to do for communication apprehension or speech anxiety is that's going to make it worse, because all of a sudden you're going to see a few people in the audience that all of a sudden they'll have a nonverbal look like, what is this person doing? You'll pick up on that, and instead of being more comforted by sheltering yourself behind your notes, you're going to realize, this isn't that much of a safety barrier as much as I thought it was.
Indeed. So personal growth is about leaning into what scares you. If you don't do that, you're going to stay stuck. You're not going to improve. You're not going to get over that fear. You're not going to get over that anxiety. There's only one way to do this, and it's to confront it. And I'm sorry, but that's just the way life is.
And you've chosen communication as a discipline. You'll hear this throughout numerous times in the quarter. I use a lot of physical fitness and sports analogies. If any of you dove in high school, you'll realize when you moved from the diving board to a platform, that probably scared you. It should have. It's a different experience, and it just doesn't feel natural. But once you start doing it, that's how you develop your skill set in it. In any other sports, that's the same thing. The first time you start playing varsity or you start practicing with the varsity squad, you realize, oh my gosh, these people are so much better than me. But your personal growth comes from leaning into what scares you as opposed to running away.
There's the ancient wisdom of the Stoics. The obstacle is the way through.
Bingo.
Whatever it is that's standing in your path,
confront it.
You just have to confront it, because it's coming for you no matter what.
Yeah.
Just do it. Don't speak from a manuscript. Don't speak from a computer screen.
Yes, okay, two things on that. First of all, manuscripts are really important when you get to the point where you're testifying maybe in court as an
Sure.
expert witness, or you're testifying in front of Congress or some kind of legislative body, the city council, county supervisors, whatever.
When it
And
matters
it's-
that
and
what
it's-
is said needs
yes.
to be gotten exactly right.
When it's going into the legal record of what's happening, a manuscript is important, okay? But even then, when you see most people on the news about their testimony in front of Congress, even news editors know that's not very exciting to watch. And so what they'll show is the question and answer period afterwards where people aren't reading from a manuscript. Second, off of a computer screen, it takes a lot of training to learn how to do this well. Occasionally you'll see John and I do it, but we've been doing this collectively for almost 60 years. And so we have a lot of experience working off of an electronic interface. Most of us, without the training of getting rid of that electronic interface as much as possible and using those as speaking notes as opposed to a direct manuscript device, most of us who do that have been doing this a long time. Contrary to that, we are pretty much encouraged as a society to, as soon as there's an electronic screen available, just stare at it. All you need to do is think about what happens in classes where there's PowerPoint. Even if it's not overloaded with information, if the instructor keeps the PowerPoint just the one word or the definition up there, you are staring at that PowerPoint more so than more so than the instructor. And when you get up and speak in front of the 250, 350 group, if you're reading off a computer screen or working off of a computer screen and you don't have extended experience in doing so, you're going to look at that just naturally a lot more. So we encourage speaking notes instead. We'll get more to that in a bit.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say about the computer screen is notifications are the devil.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I hesitate to want to speak from computer screens because if I've forgotten to put on the do not disturb mode or focus or whatever they call it now, I cannot look. I can't not look. There's something inside of me, and so I have to be really judicious when using a computer, especially when it counts. To make sure that I'm not going to be interrupted by those notifications. And frankly, most of the time I would rather just speak from a device that doesn't have notifications, like a paper tablet or, paper.
Hard copy, yeah.
This old school.
Yeah.
So lastly, you've got to control your body and your voice, your vocal tone, your volume, your rate of speech, your gestures, your posture, your location on the stage. You need to look like you're doing things in a deliberate sort of way. You need to vary these things. It needs to be a little bit dynamic.
Yeah, and again, that also is a function of reading the room. And reading the room is going to, if you think that this is not a skill you need to hone, you're just wrong. Because your need to read the room is going to exponentially increase as you move through your life and as you move through your career and industry interests. One of the examples which I'll show about this comes from, I hope some of you have at least visited the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. And the reason that the people who guard the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier have the demeanor they do is because of what they're guarding. They're reading the room. They are there to keep people basically in control and keep them in a state of just almost awe, if not just a very respectful somberness that other venues don't allow for. And John and I both have different experiences of this, which we'll talk about when we get to that. So just remember, when I show you some of this, we're referring to how it is you control your body and voice and why you need to learn how to vary that depending on your audience and the purpose of your presentation.
Yeah. All right. So this next section here is about having some style. I'm going to go through this one. I think we should go through this one quickly because it's stuff that people can look up. But there's a lot of different ways that you can bring emphasis to your speech and improve retention. You can use alliteration. You can use antithesis, ideograph, maxims, metaphors, parallelism, personification, repetition, simile. I don't think we need to go through all of these individually.
You're in Cal Poly. You clearly have probably had, most of you have had some type of, at least accelerated, if not high-level English class in high school, and you've had at least a basic exposure to composition and English literature classes by this point in your time at Cal Poly. And all of these are just standard, what we call rhetorical devices that you use to stylize your presentation.
Use them strategically. Figure out how they're going to make just zhuzh up your presentation a little bit. You can just present the information straight, but if you have sort of like a sense of play when it's appropriate, people like that. And it makes you more charismatic, and it makes you more likable. And at the end of the day, that's what you want happening at the end of your speech. All right.
All right, there's one. Okay, well, I'll look it up and we'll start class on Wednesday with it. But there's one that the Trump campaign did really well yesterday in front of, I think they were in Michigan. I was watching the news last night, and it was ban Biden's border something, and it was another
border or
yeah,
something?
it was really well done, and that's an example of alliteration. John is excellent at alliteration, antithesis, and parallelism, so yeah, if you have questions about any of these, or you want to spice up, if you want to stylize up your presentation, again, don't hesitate to contact us.
I'm super into students that want to talk to me about like how can I make this sound cool. That's I love that. All right, so also be specific and engaging. We talked earlier about concreteness. Concrete language is kind of everything. You know, your audience, if you can help them like see what you're talking about, that's better than if it's all abstract. You know, then there's visualization. Like if you can get them to actually experience sensory kind of reactions to what you're saying, that's a fantastic way to keep people focused and engaged. I think use humor and charisma if you can. You know, irony is kind of cool. It expresses, this sort of surprising thing. Sarcasm can be a subset of irony. Be careful with these. Irony can, if not everyone's in on the joke, people can take you seriously, and that could cause some problems for you. Especially if you're being ironic in ways that are just like not particularly appropriate. And then, reference the unusual. Reference things that are sort of unbelievable or startling or something that just is changes around the way you would think about something. Then finally, you've just got to demonstrate some self-discipline and professionalism. If you can, try to eliminate non-fluencies and verbal crutches from your speech. Non-fluencies are your things like your uhs and your ums, these sort of non-verbal utterances. And verbal crutches are things that you say over and over and over again. A lot of students say the word like constantly. There are other words that exist. Some people put the word right on the end of every sentence or every other sentence. That can be quite distracting. If you have unfamiliar words or names that you're working with, Google how to pronounce them before you get up there, mispronounce it, and tell a room full of 50 people, I don't know how to pronounce that. How many times I've seen that? How many times have you seen that?
I too much. And the worst, I've seen
Google
it.
exists.
Well, I've seen it with people who are otherwise professional speakers. And I'm like,
oh, yeah.
How did you make that mistake? Okay, inevitably sometimes we will mispronounce things, but there are two things going on. The first is if you don't know the pronunciation of a word, or in particular a name, get a pronunciation down, and if you use it more than once, use that same pronunciation, because it signals that you at least realize that you should be signaling professionalism. Second, John's right. Google exists, and that's amazing to look at. And one of the things you might want to do if you're reading, I mean, this is something that's maybe a little more advanced, but if you realize you're reading something that's maybe written in and translated from another language, or you're looking at non-American but English written text, you might want to check the pronunciation, because we do technically, Americans, Aussies, Brits, the Irish, and Kiwis, we pronounce things a lot differently. So depending on your audience, learning to read the room and getting the correct pronunciation is there. Basically, the easy takeaway there is if there are more vowels in the word than how you're used to spelling it, it means it's a non-American English word, and look up that pronunciation so that you say it correctly for an American audience. If you're speaking to the Brits, if you're doing study abroad, something like that, you might want to consider speaking that dialect.
Yeah, absolutely. And, everyone has an accent. And you should articulate and pronounce words with clarity appropriate to your accent. you know, take the time to have a bit of diction. Take the time to make sure that your words aren't blending together or slurring, and that your audience will be able to understand every syllable. And finally, just be mindful that thick California accents might be harmful to credibility with non-California audiences. In the same way that you think people from Alabama sound dumb, people in New York think we sound dumb. Mm-hmm. And so this is especially true if you have like that Valley accent or that sort of like Bay Area accent. The one with a lot of the vocal fry on the end. There's
It's
California.
the vocal fry. That's insane. If you don't know what vocal fry is, you should look it up and look at examples of it. And you'll laugh if you do it yourself, because you'll realize you're just, oh yeah, that's when I'm actually signaling to the people I'm speaking to that I don't give a fuck about what I'm talking about.
And the other thing that we do as Californians that is just, it's just so grating, is uptalk.
Oh, the uptalk.
The uptalk where every statement
sounds like a sentence.
It sounds like a question.
Or I'm sorry, it sounds like a question. Yeah.
I went to the supermarket today, and they had salami. Did you? Did they?
Yeah.
I don't know. Why are you asking me questions about your day?
Right.
You know, like
yeah.
So, you know, I don't.
And remember what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the way you are as a person in interpersonal communication. Or family communication, or even small group communication, depending on whether it's professional or not.
Right, all of these are appropriate.
Absolutely. We're talking about how you present to a general audience that is one to many, as opposed to one to a few or one to one.
Yeah. So that's, I think, everything that we need to get through today.
Yeah, today I think what we'll start with on the next time we meet, one of the things we want to workshop with you is, and so if you have questions about this beforehand, please approach us. And if not, consider reviewing whatever notes you might have on this from 101 or wherever you took public speaking, is the transition from a manuscript or from a lot of print to speaking notes. Because we are going to definitely discipline people a little bit more, and we're going to be a lot more adamant about making sure people speak from speaking notes as opposed to a manuscript or heavy text. Okay, so just know that's coming. If you know that you're someone that does have a lot of difficulty with eye contact and you experience a lot of communication apprehension or speech anxiety, again, I can't emphasize this enough, talk to us after class, make an appointment with us, talk to us during office hours.
Absolutely.
We both have a lot of experience dealing with this. I mean, I did personally, but also just as a professional coach for the last 30 years, I've definitely taken some people who have difficulty with that and moved them into becoming really good extemporaneous speaking. So that's what's on the agenda for, let's see, when we see you on Wednesday. Whenever that next workshop is. I don't think it's Wednesday. I can't remember. You'll see it on Canvas. But yeah, that's what we'll be working towards, is taking you from lots of scripted sentences and lots of heavy content to speaking notes that allow you to engage your audience with eye contact and conversational skills, speaking skills.